Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our last session of the day. So the session is going to start by a keynote, and we're going to conclude with a panel. And the theme is changing the landscape of AIoT together. And we are very, very pleased and fortunate today to have a great keynote speaker with us, which I'm really, really pleased to introduce to you. Her name is Timnit Gebru. She's a research scientist at Google AI in the ethical AI team. She has a postdoctorate from Microsoft Research in New York at the Fairness, Transparency, Accountability, and Ethics AI group. She studied algorithm, bias, and the ethical implications underlying any data mining projects. She received a PhD from Stanford in computer vision under Fei-Fei Li. She is also a co-founder of Black in AI, a group that is an organization that's dedicated to increase the presence of Black researchers in AI. So I'm really pleased to introduce you today, Timnit Gebru.
Hi, everybody. So I might skip a bunch of slides because I have 59, but I've gone through them in 25 minutes before, so hopefully I'll do that. I actually wanted to say before I start that I used to be a hardware engineer. I worked at Apple for 6 years, and a lot of this stuff I'm doing right now is actually inspired by like the processes that we have to have in the hardware world because you can't just move fast and break things, right? It's like move very slowly and don't break anything. So I just wanted to say that because today I'm going to talk about a paper I wrote with a history student, which feels a little bit kind of far away maybe from what we're all doing, but I think the point I want to make here is that we should kind of break down the barriers, that disciplinary barriers that we kind of naturally think of as different and have more interdisciplinary work. Okay, so many issues in fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics are rooted in the data collection process, right? But like that process is very, very complicated. So for example, there's issues of privacy, consent, like whose data is being used by whom. There's issues of categorizing people. So for example, when you're gathering data from people, how you categorize them. Sometimes you're categorizing them in manners in which they don't want to be categorized. So this is an example called Counting the Countless. It's a talk that critiques my paper, which is this paper. So the talk, the Counting the Countless, critiques the fact that in our paper, which I'll talk about really quickly, a prior paper, that we worked on automatic gender recognition tools. So have you guys heard of automatic gender recognition tools? So basically what we did is we tried to analyze the bias, we tried to systematically analyze the bias present in automated facial analysis tools, and not like just research tools, but tools that you actually have to pay for that are out there that can be used by anybody, right? And so we picked one specific type of API, which is automatic gender recognition. So what they do is they see a picture and they say whether this is a male or a female, so binary gender. And so the talk Counting the Countless was talking about categorizing in this way, how it inherently harms certain groups of people, especially the people in the trans community, etc. So I suggest you read it as well because I learned a lot from that critique of our work. So when we did this, when we wrote this paper, when we did this analysis, we found that as you go darker and darker in skin type, so random chance would be 50% accuracy, right? Male, female. As you go darker and darker in skin type, you get to basically like random chance, right? And so this showed that for darker skinned women, especially, there's a high error rates, whereas for lighter skinned men, there's, well, you don't see the results here, but like much lower error rates. So this paper came out, and there was a whole kind of splash, and there were good lessons learned, in my opinion, and not the best lessons learned. So the good lessons for me were that like senators were asking the FBI to investigate its use of automated facial analysis tools given the kinds of errors that we were seeing. Not the best. Some of the other issues that I saw, like the lessons that were not great though, is that, for example, Microsoft and IBM came out and they said, hey, like we fixed it because now the disparities in error rates in this task are not so high between lighter skinned men and darker skinned women. But the thing is, as some of the critiques have shown, is that the task of automatic gender recognition itself is a harmful task, especially for certain groups of people. And the task, it kind of also perpetuates gender biases. So I can recommend some references there, but we don't have so much time to get into it. So saying that you basically close the error gap on a particular task that's, you know, certain groups of people find to be harmful is not really the best answer, right? In some cases, you have to diversify your data set. You have to close the error gap. But in other cases, you have to think about the task itself and whether or not this task should exist. And so some of these lessons I don't feel like were great. The other lesson was, now in our work, we showed that data sets have to be diversified. And so like and we had a hypothesis for some of the reasons that these issues existed. But recently there was this news story where a subcontractor was found to be kind of targeting darker skinned people and like in some questionable ways. And that was not the lesson that we wanted people to take from our work either, right? So speaking of the complexity of this issue, there's also the task itself. Like I said, automated face recognition. There's who's using it on whom. So in terms of diversifying data sets, for example, there is a growing demand for African faces and that are being taken without their consent to be used in automated facial recognition analysis tasks. Now, so sometimes we need to make sure that there aren't disparate error rates. So if we're doing like melanoma detection or some other task where it's really important to have, you know, equal error rates and equal accuracy across tasks, that's kind of what we need to do. But sometimes a particular task maybe should just not exist. And sometimes the task is okay, but the manner in which it's used, you know, is problematic, right? And in terms of, you know, a lot of what I'll talk about is going to be based on automated facial analysis tools because that's just my background. So this is not new, right? So like this is an example from World War II that told you like how to distinguish between Japanese people and Chinese people because we're targeting Japanese people. Chinese people are okay, right? Japanese Americans versus Chinese Americans. So imagine this being done at scale, right? Which is happening right now, the targeting of Muslim minorities. But we don't have to go to China. We have all sorts of targeting happening in the US, right? So if you guys are interested in this kind of stuff, I recommend that you follow the Center for Privacy and Security at Georgetown Law. So they just had this report called, what is it called? The Perpetual Lineup. And then later they have America Under Watch that discusses basically the fact that 1 in 2 American adults are in a face recognition database, and there is no, like law enforcement can use it however they want, whenever they want, for whatever reason they want. And in terms of like the task, so there's also, you know, Amazon using face recognition, selling face recognition technology to police. And I kind of want this room to think about a couple of things, right? Who are the people, let's talk about in the US, that are targeted by, I can't go back, can I? That are targeted by law enforcement. And, you know, who are the people that are creating this technology, right? So this is a conference called iClear. It's a Conference on Learning and Representations, which is gonna be in Ethiopia for the first time. But can you point a woman here? I mean, you know what I mean? It's the Where's Waldo of deep learning. Like I can't. So the point I'm trying to make is that, so some people ask me, you know, why do I work so hard on Black and AI? Is that for me, these issues are all intertwined, right? It's not the kind of thing where I can just say, hey, I like my, I don't know if you guys might like delta sigma modulators given working on A to D convergence and stuff. I used to love doing that kind of stuff. But here, it's not a kind of thing where you can say, oh, I like working on X, Y, and Z. I'm just going to not think about how it's being used in society. We have to look at technology as a socio-technical system, right? So the technology is embedded in society. How people use it, who uses it, on whom, what documentation is available, et cetera, is really important. Now, when we're talking about this kind of stuff like ethics, there's other issues too. So right now, there's a lot of these ethics initiatives, and a lot of times what's happening is a lot of very privileged people and very privileged institutions are working on ethics without involving the groups of people, the marginalized groups of people that are most harmed by or most affected by these kinds of technology. So why did I talk about this? In our field, in my field, there's a budding field of algorithmic fairness. We even have a conference for it now. This year is going to be the 3rd time it's running. And a lot of this literature now, people are starting to take these kinds of issues seriously. But even when they're writing about it and when they're providing guidelines, they're always at the algorithmic level, right? They're thinking of data collection as something boring, something fixed, whatever. And so once you're doing that, or like somebody does that, someone gives you data, what can I do in my modeling that quote unquote debiases stuff? But actually, a lot of people, like I said, a lot of the issues are rooted in the actual data collection process, and a lot of people are looking for guidelines in that data collection process. So what I'm arguing for is that within machine learning itself, we need to kind of like respect data, and we need to take it seriously. We need to have a subspecialty that teaches people all of these issues really, that arise when you're collecting data. We need to respect it in our conferences. We need to teach about it in our classes, and this is really not something we do. So some of the issues I kind of touched on are consent, power dynamics. Some powerful entity has your data. You don't have as much data on that powerful entity. Oops, I'm sorry. Did I mess up my mic or am I fine? Okay, good. Sorry. Inclusivity, but like while you're trying to diversify your data, how do you not do what Ruha Benjamin calls predatory inclusion, right? Like in the name of diversifying your data, how do you not further harm people? Representation, subgroup classification and annotation, right? So if you're annotating people and you're saying like, oh, what's your sexual orientation, what's your gender, etc., what's your race, and sometimes race is actually like it's a social construct that's unstable across time and space, which is why in our paper that I showed you earlier, we actually looked at skin type, darker, lighter, etc. Privacy and ethics, transparency. We have so many issues to deal with in data, right? But we don't do it in a systematic manner. So I think we need to have like an interdisciplinary approach because there are many other fields that have looked at this. One is anthropology. So there is this blog post that I recommend that people read, talking about how anthropologists have been here before and what kind of lessons we should learn. The one that I will talk a little bit about today is archives. And so it's weird that I wrote a paper, I kind of partner with a history student, but this history student is an archival history student, a PhD student. And archives are the oldest attempt in my opinion, in my limited knowledge, according to her. Does anybody know about archives here? Is there someone who can help us out or no? Okay, so I guess I'm the archives expert here, which I'm not. But archives are the oldest attempts to gather human data, right? And there's many different kinds of examples. There are like private archives and public archives. And what's really interesting is historians told me they're actually worried about the current time that we're in today. Like even though it seems like we have a lot of data, it's not being archived properly. And so, so the Internet Archive is trying to just archive a whole bunch of websites, but they're not doing it as systematically as other archives do. So we kind of look at data collection spectrum. There's the Wild Wild West spectrum and the curational data collection spectrum, right? The Wild Wild West spectrum, in my opinion, at least in machine learning, it's kind of like where we are right now. We're just trying to get as much data as possible, right? And the curational data collection is just driven by the institution's agenda. And so in the Wild West spectrum, we don't have as much, supervision on the data collection and handling. We're just trying to get data, right? Like from Wikipedia or from Reddit or whatever. And in the curational data, they have a lot of, selective curation. And the objectives are different. Archives, they're trying to preserve memory. We're like, commercial, profit-driven, of course, research-driven. So the audience is limited for archives. For us, we have a much wider audience. And the feedback is really fast, well, faster, I would say, in the non-hardware world. And even like too fast. In a curational data collection, it's slow. And what I'm really trying to do in our industry, at least in my industry where I am, is to slow things down and to have processes and kind of like frameworks that just slow the whole process down. And so the issue is like, so in our large data set collection, we're trying to just kind of replicate natural data, right? Like the internet, as much data as possible. But then there's like biases, right? Social biases, there's biases on which age pop group is gonna be represented on the internet, which geographic group, et cetera, and how. And then in the curational data collector, of course, there's the biases of the curator and the institution. And so we call this part like interventionist, and we call that, that doesn't make sense, this part and that part. The archival part we call interventionist, and where we are right now, we call it more laissez-faire. And what we're trying to say is we need to be a little bit more interventionist. So in archival history, they have a whole plan for data collection, right? And the plan goes from a macro plan to micro plan. So they have a mission statement, and then that mission statement guides the collection development policy. Then there's appraisal of each document to see whether it should be kept or not. Then there's processing, right? Like there's a pretty well-defined process. And so here you can see like a mission statement, which is the highest level of agenda. There's a collection development policy, the appraisal, and then there's different people involved at different stages, and sources can be discarded or added. So for example, if you find that there aren't, people with certain characteristics or something, like the archival historians might partner with certain organizations to have data from those kinds of people. Well, I don't think I need to go through this. I just thought it was interesting that like there's shared concerns like in the archival history, and it seems like they talk about the same stuff that we talk about today. So for example, they talk about, digitization programs could reinforce cultural stereotypes, which is the kind of stuff we're talking about in bias and machine learning. They also talk about like being an archive is like it's not just data, but like a status. So this is just to show there's like a lot of writings and theory that we can learn from. Just because it's history, we shouldn't discard it. Another thing that's interesting for me about archives, because we were talking about, I was talking about power dynamics, right? So one of the interesting things that we found is that, or not that we found, but that I was told was that do you guys know about GDPR? Yes, the General Data Protection Act from the EU. A lot of the stocks of larger companies went up and stocks of smaller companies went down because larger companies have the infrastructure, more like resources to make sure they comply, right? So the question is like, how can smaller institutions sort of band together to achieve this? So in archives, they have data consortiums. So these smaller institutions band together and they pool resources to form data consortiums, and this helps them, gather more data from locations that maybe they can't have, et cetera. And so I think actually what's interesting is right now people are talking about data consortiums in the AI sense. And so instead of like reinventing the wheel, I think it would be interesting to see what their model's like for archives. Another interesting thing I found is community participatory archives. So in archives, again, similar to machine learning or AI or whatever, they've had similar critiques as to who's doing the collecting on which population, right? So a lot of Native American groups did not like the way in which they were portrayed in particular archives, whose story is being told from whose perspectives. So then some people started this this participatory archives that are maintained by the community, and basically their culture is represented in the manner in which they think is appropriate, right? So in the sense that the data is annotated by the labels that they think best represents them. So for me, it's like when we're doing crowdsourcing to annotate data sets, how can we kind of incorporate some of these ideas from community archives? Another thing that I find really interesting is the code of conduct that they have for archival history. So there's something called the partnership in AI. Have you guys heard about the partnership in AI? So the partnership in AI has like it's supposed to be a nonprofit. It's a nonprofit. It has like all of the big companies and some nonprofits, a whole bunch of nonprofits. Now I think there's a lot of partners now involved. And it's supposed to try to hold like companies accountable, right? But I'm not exactly sure how successful it's going to be, or it's just a new thing, relatively new. So I don't know how influential it has been in terms of enforcing codes of conduct. But like in archives, you know, the stakes I think are much higher because first of all, the person who is gathering data is a full-time. Their job is to gather data full-time, right? So I think personally, like there should be people in companies whose full-time job is to gather data because there's so much complexity around gathering data. It shouldn't be like, you know, a lot of times right now it's like you're a researcher, I'm a researcher, I need to do this X, Y, and Z. I go find the data and then somehow it finds its way to a product, you know? And I think there needs to be like a lot more deliberate kind of hiring of people who are working on data. So then the stakes are really high. So for archives, each archivist is part of an organization, right? And so they have to subscribe individually to a particular code of conduct that is cross-institutional, not just, you know, their own company or institution that they're working in. And then, of course, there's like the institutional code of conduct and institutional processes that they have to go through. And then there's like cross-institutional panels, I guess similar to IRBs or something like that, that they have to see. So I think the stakes are higher, and I think there's more checks and balances, and I think this is something that we can learn from. I don't think we need to go through appraisal. So one example I wanted to give is like, so some ways in which archives have partnered with other organizations is that like, right now in machine learning at least, we're letting the source of data guide what is available, right? So I don't know if you guys have heard of GPT-2. It's OpenAI, like the language model. So it was trained on Reddit, right? Because Reddit was just available, right? But then if you do analysis on Reddit, you'll see like, so this is a language model. And so if you train on Reddit, like you'll see, if you do an analysis in Reddit, you'll see like, okay, who's represented on Reddit? Like who's not represented, right? Perhaps what would it, like, we had a case study in our paper, like what would it look like if they went through this archival history process of gathering the data, right? Like you might identify gaps in your data set, and then you might say, oh, we probably need to partner with certain groups of people to have a particular data from certain groups of people. So for example, organizations have partnered with Lighthouse for the Blind, other groups, and this also makes it such that, you know, you're not doing quote unquote predatory inclusion, right? Like you're not approaching, you know, it doesn't, it's the consent and like the trust that you have with certain groups of people is much better if you partner with organizations. So I think that actually, yeah, this is kind of what I said. I don't really know if I want to say that much more. Yeah, so I talked about our exclusivity for archives. We talked about what kind of stuff that archival historians do to further inclusivity in data collection, basically from the long tail, which is a lot of people who are not represented. I don't really think I have to go through any more of these slides. And yeah, I think this is all stuff I said, actually. So conclusion. Societal biases enter in many, you know, they enter in many, many different parts, right? The first is when we formulate what problems to work on. Like, what is an important problem? What is an important research question? that's a huge societal bias, right? Like, who thinks what question is important for whom? And then there's the collect and training and evaluation data, which is what I tried to touch on today. A huge chunk of it is when you're collecting training and evaluation data. Then there's architecting our models and loss functions, which in my field, that's kind of like what all the papers basically focus on. And then there's analyzing how our models are used in society and then looping back in, which we don't do as much in our field. Like, what kinds of documentations are available, who's using it for what purpose, are they using it in a manner in which we didn't expect? Like, for example, that America Under Watch report that I talked about earlier, they showed, like, for example, what they did was, let's say this one law enforcement, person, they were looking for a suspect. And then they didn't have a picture of the suspect. So they said, oh, I think he looked like Woody Harrelson. So let's just take a picture of Woody Harrelson, Photoshop his eyes for a little bit, and then put that into the model that searches for nearest neighbor suspects, right? But this is not the intended use of that model, right? But a lot of times, Amazon or whoever else is creating these things is not doing that analysis to see what, the manner in which it's being used, and we don't have any sort of regulation or any safeguards to make sure that it's not being used in a manner that's infringing on human rights. But even though we have all of these different things that are very important, a lot of our papers, our classes, incentive structures, et cetera, at least in my field, focus on this one part. And so I hope that we can focus on the rest of it. And I think that's it. I think we need to break down these barriers between different disciplines. You might not think that you have a lot in common with a historian, but you probably do. I thought that from being an analog circuit designer to whatever I'm doing right now was just such a detour, and I had a crisis and everything. But now I'm realizing that actually, I did have a real crisis. Being like, what am I doing? Am I a hardware engineer? Am I a software engineer? Am I a machine learning person? What am I doing with my life, right? But I'm learning now that actually, I wrote a paper called Data Sheets for Data Sets. And you all know what data sheets are, right? Obviously, it's obvious for everyone. And so for me, I wanted to write a paper being like, I need data, that's what we need. We need data sheets for data sets and model cards for model reporting. And Google just announced that they're going to have model cards. They're basically data sheets for but for models, right? And you would think this is a thing that exists. For you guys, it's probably yeah, how come we don't have that? And that's what I thought. I'm like, how can we not have that? And so even though we think that there's these barriers across disciplines, I think there are a lot of times we have a lot in common, and so probably talk to a historian, a social scientist, and I don't know, you might do interesting things. That's it. Thank you.